All right, hey, Alicante, great to be here. Thank you all for coming. This is, I have to say, I'm super stoked to be here. Spain is a really special place to me. I came here about 8 years ago, 2015, not to Alicante specifically, but if anybody familiar with the Camino de Santiago, anyone heard of that little guy? So I came here about 8 years ago and hiked a bit in the northern section of Spain, in the Basque country, and absolutely gorgeous. And if you ever have an opportunity to do that, it is one of the most spectacular experiences of my life. And so I just heavily associate this place with that time in my life. It was a very transformative period. And it's actually when I sort of decided to make a career transition. I'd not really considered myself a web developer, even though I had built a few websites at the time. But I wasn't doing it professionally, at least not full time. I was one of those agency code monkeys where I was technically a project manager, but I worked with a bunch of developers and we were building WordPress sites and just shipping things really fast. And that's kind of how I cut my teeth in the web dev space. And it was in a hostel in Güemes, Spain, in the northern Basque country, where I was laying in bed thinking, what am I doing with my life? I hate my job. I hate where this is going. I'd already switched careers 3 or 4 times, and I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. And it was at that moment that I decided, I know what I want to be when I grow up. I want to be a middle school social studies teacher. And you know what? I did not do that. But I did go to get a master's degree in education, and when I started that program at the agency that I was working at, I just started working a little more closely with the developers I was managing and realized that, you know what, this code thing looks kind of fun. And I know a little bit, so maybe I could do that for at least a short time while I work on my degree. And I had convinced the folks at my agency to let me show them that, hey, I can actually build some of our websites. I know how to do this. And yeah, that was the intro to my web dev career, and I got a master's degree and never used it. So good times. But that's just a little bit of my backstory and a fun little picture of me on I think this is somewhere outside of San Sebastian as I was hiking the Camino. So good times there. You might know some of the work that I've done in the open source space. I worked on a few libraries that a few folks have used. React Router, I think, has a few users in the room, maybe? React Router users? Great. For a time, I was the lead developer and maintainer of Reach UI, open source UI library rooted around accessibility. Radix UI, which I sort of see as the spiritual successor to Reach UI in a way. And most recently worked on the Remix team before I started working in my current role as a product developer on a tool called Replo. There's a little bit of my background. Now I'm going to tell you a little bit about why I still choose React. And why do I say that? Why do I still choose React? Well, yesterday we heard a few talks. Eric gave a great talk yesterday morning as an intro to Solid.js for React developers. Solid's an awesome library. We will talk a little bit about that. There's other frameworks that you can choose these days. You've got Vue, you have Svelte, you've got Quick, you have Astro, which tries to let you use all of them. So you have a lot of options. I mean, as a front-end developer, I don't feel like we've ever been in such a strong position to build excellent user interfaces and ship them to our clients in a number of different ways, all of which I think are absolutely fantastic. So one thing this is not going to be, it's not going to be a talk where I am down on any other framework. I'm not going to be talking about why you should or shouldn't use a framework. I'm talking purely why I think React is still a really great choice in 2023. I don't think you can go wrong by making that choice. I think ultimately a lot of this comes down to personal preference. But I do think there are some unique strengths in React that we still have yet to fully appreciate. And as these new frameworks come out with new approaches to things, I think it's important to analyze different trade-offs that we make when we decide whether or not to stick with the thing we know or move to this new fancy shiny thing over here. So that's a little bit about what I am going to talk about. So before I talk about why I still use React, I want to ask why any of us use React in the first place. So for me, React, so yeah, we got a component model out of React, but React was not the component model. That wasn't why we wanted to use React, and that wasn't even the original selling point of React. We had component models already. AngularJS gave us a component model, right? We had Ember. Anybody use Ember back in the day? Ember had a component model. So we had component models. React was a little different. The way I understand it, I didn't work at Facebook. The way I understand it was when Jordan pitched the original idea for React, he basically said, what happens if we just, so to back up a little bit, some of the problems before React were, synchronizing UI with your current state, right? If state was basically managed by sending a bunch of events and listening for events and trying to bind certain event handlers to different elements and components and make sure that your updates are synchronizing. And it got really hard as your application grew and grew and grew, and state was changing all over the place, and you had little synchronization bugs. Like you would have a notification bar at the top that showed that you had 10 notifications, and you would click on it, but then your notification window popped up, and there were no notifications. And so you had all of these interesting synchronization issues. And so when they first pitched this idea, the pitch was simply, what happened, what if we just threw away everything and started over? What happens if we just blew the UI up, blew everything away, the entire tree, and just re-rendered everything based on the current state at that time? So essentially removing the idea of time from that equation and saying that UI is a function of our state. And so that seemed kind of nuts, right? Like, how could we possibly do that in a way that's not going to absolutely destroy performance, right? Like this is, are we going to really go through the DOM and just update every single element in the DOM tree? Like that's going to be a nightmare, right? And so of course they didn't do that. They implemented a pretty smart system, this idea of a virtual DOM that was much, much faster to analyze. And of course we're not actually going to redo everything, but we are going to analyze everything, and we're going to update in our virtual DOM everything in that tree based on the new state of our application, thus making our UI a function of our state. So now, as long as our state is updated in one place, everything in our UI should be able to access the state. So we shouldn't have any of these synchronization issues. So that was the original sell, and I think, to me, that was beautiful at the time. I mean, I wasn't, to be fair, I was not one of the OG early adopter React users, and I know that when that idea was pitched to the community at large, they got a lot of pushback on that. Not to mention, HTML in my JavaScript, that's weird. We'll talk a little bit about that, but that's not what anyone wanted, right? Like, there was a lot of weird stuff. But at the end of the day, what was really nice about it was that it was just JavaScript, right? Except for JSX, right? Like, we don't worry about that little guy. But even JSX, right? Like, JSX is just a wrapper around a function call that produces a JavaScript object. So it's not like this crazy wild, we're not really putting HTML in our JavaScript. We're really just co-locating, templating in a way that looks familiar to us because we know we're rendering HTML at the end of the day. So it was kind of nice that in being able to present itself in this sort of simplistic way that we all kind of understand, because it has that common shared language of JavaScript, and we even have the niceties of the formatting and the templating and whatnot. So fast forward a few years, and we've all sort of accepted that this is our new reality, right? It's just JavaScript. We should be able to understand it, right? And that was kind of what a lot of folks were saying, especially as more and more alternatives started to show up. As soon as we saw Vue, I think Vue came out maybe a year or two after React came out, and Vue gave us this, really interesting system of these single file components where you had kind of 3 different languages all in the same file, and in your templating language, it looked like HTML, but wasn't actually HTML. You have these directives that look kind of like HTML attributes, but they're actually magic JavaScript strings that somehow synchronize with what's in your script tag. And for me, at least, like looking at that and then trying to figure out what's actually HTML and what's actually JavaScript and what's actually going to be executed and how all of that synchronizes together. Something about the simplicity of React being just JavaScript just really, I really identify with that, and I enjoyed using it. But I don't know, is it just JavaScript? Like now, like looking back on all that time, I don't know that I think about it that way. I might try to reframe this a little differently. Does anybody remember this talk? Did anyone see this talk in 2018? My friend Ryan Florence and former coworker on the Remix team introduced the world to hooks at ReactConf in 2018, and he told us that you would write 90% cleaner React with hooks, right? He gave this awesome demo, like I think one of the most incredible demos in all of the React conferences that we had seen up to that point. Really great demo introducing hooks and selling the idea to a lot of React developers who didn't really understand what he was talking about, because we had always thought in these component life cycles, right? So he sold us his idea on hooks and writing cleaner code because we could get rid of all of these lifecycle methods. Because if you weren't around pre-hooks, or you have very little exposure to that to those days, the lifecycle methods were simple in a way in the sense that we got to think very clearly in terms of, when my component mounts, do this thing, when it updates based on these props, do this thing, and when it dismounts, do all of these things. But remember, our UI is a function of state, not time, right? And we're still kind of thinking in time. Like the component lifecycle still exposes that to a degree, and that really isn't or wasn't in the spirit of React telling us that our UI is a function of our state, right? Time, we know time exists and we have to deal with it, but it really shouldn't be at the front of our mind like it was with the lifecycle methods, and it created a lot of complexity, especially if you wanted to compose non-rendering logic, and hooks kind of solved a lot of that for us. And in fact, I'd say a lot of our code was cleaner, but I would probably say 90% cleaner code. Might reframe that a little bit. I think maybe a better way to frame it is to say that 90% of the time our code is a little cleaner, right? Now the problem is that there's still 10% of the time, right? That's, it's 10, 90, whatever, but 10's kind of a lot. There's a lot of stuff that we have to deal with hooks that maybe it's not so clean after all. Maybe there are some issues here that we need to deal with, or at least admit to ourselves we might have a bit of a problem. And so, what does that look like? Now, we've all seen some stuff here, so let's just run through a really quick example. Let's say you need to instantiate a simple object, right? This is just JavaScript. And this is say we have a class component. Right, you instantiate an object in a class component that you might use somewhere in your lifecycle methods or in rendering, and you stick it on a class property, runs one time. As soon as the component is called, you're going to instantiate that object, and now you're going to be able to use it anywhere, and that's probably what you want in most cases. But then hooks come out. We're in a really big hurry to refactor all of our code because we want to use hooks. We want to be right on the cutting edge. We want our code to be 90% cleaner, right? So, of course, we're going to refactor to hooks, and this is now a function component, and we instantiate our object, and we're good to go, right? Absolutely not, of course, because our function component is called on every single render, right? So if we just instantiate that object in the render method of our class component, which is effectively what we'd be doing that over and over and over again. So we say, okay, we only want to actually instantiate this thing once, so let's stick it inside of a callback and use state, and that's going to initialize when the component first runs, and then we're done with it, right? Oh, I forgot. This particular object uses DOM APIs, and our app is rendered on the server, so we can't really initialize it there because we're going to hit those DOM APIs. The node server is not going to recognize them. We're going to get an error, and our app's going to crash. So, all right, cool. We have to do that on the client. So we move that inside of a use effect, right? And then we set some state, and now we're good to go, right? Well, maybe, but fast forward a few years, and even though we put the empty bracket as our dependency array, telling React, hey, we only want to run this thing one time because our brain still thinks in lifecycle methods despite years of using hooks. That's just kind of how we've all programmed ourselves to think. No brackets means component is just mounted and you run it once. But React 18 came and said, no. React 18 says no. Your effects are not only guaranteed to run one time or even when all of your dependencies change. Interestingly enough, concurrent features say that, or dictate that maybe, just maybe in some scenarios, your effect actually might get called a few times, depending on the circumstance. And in fact, if you're in development mode and you wrap your app in strict mode, as many of us do to catch a lot of bugs potentially, it'll always run twice, right? And so, okay, well, we have to deal with that. So let's, I don't know, let's throw a ref in there and track. Have we initialized this thing once? Okay, no, let's initialize it, then go, and then we only do it once, right? And sure, that should work, right? Oh, but wait, like I just realized I don't actually need to render anything in this component at all unless I, if some condition is not met. So maybe I'm on a specific route and I don't even need any of this code. So I just say, you know what, get out of here. Oh wait, no, rule of hooks. Just JavaScript isn't really just JavaScript anymore because this is totally valid JavaScript, right? Like call a function conditionally, but you can't do that with hooks. You can't do that with hooks. Hooks have to run in the same order every single time, every render. It's a rule of hooks. React has rules beyond the scope of the JavaScript rules. So now we're sort of entering this murky, not so just JavaScript world anymore. And so, okay, we move that to the end. We're all good. Oh, wait, we need a cleanup function here. This is where things get really hairy because we've got this weird initialization check. And our cleanup function is going to get called every time the effect runs and then reruns right before the next run. So when do we actually do the cleanup here if we only want to run this thing once? I don't know. I still don't really know the exact answer to that question. It's kind of a mystery. The React team hasn't really given us a good answer to that. So you look at stuff like this and you say, wow, is my code really 90% cleaner? I have no idea what's going on, right? So like, let's clean up our code a little bit. How do we clean up code? Easy. We pack it away and we put it inside of a custom hook. And you never look at it again. That's how you write clean code, right? Like you just don't think about it. That's pretty. I like that. So yeah, like there's some rough edges, and I get it. And so, obviously other people are going to have different ideas about how to approach some of the problems after we've encountered some of these rough edges. And yeah, some other frameworks have come out and said, we might have some better ideas here. Maybe React is of the past, and we're hanging on to these old ideas. We've got a lot of good ideas from them, but I think we can improve upon those things. And like that's not even the worst example, by the way. Like this, I copied and pasted this use effect from my work. This is from the application I work on every day. And I was a little worried about sharing proprietary code, but then I actually pasted it, and I was like, no, I'm not that worried. You're not going to be able to read that. So, but that's one use effect. Like has anybody seen one like this? Does anyone have one like this in their code base at work? Yeah, yeah. And there are a lot of really good developers in here who've probably written code like this, right? It's the exception, but when you run into these exceptions, it's pretty painful. Friend David down here is going to talk a little bit later. He's got a great talk on why you probably don't need use effect, and you should probably go find that and watch it again. But sometimes you do, and sometimes it looks like this, and it can get pretty gnarly. So what do we do? Now what? What do we do? Maybe? I don't know. We keep hearing this word a lot. Signals, right? What are signals? Eric gave a great talk on this yesterday when he introduced us to solid.js, but everyone here has heard of signals at this point, right? So maybe signals are the answer to all of our problems. All this stuff goes away. We don't have to worry about dependency arrays and all that nonsense. It just works, right? But is that really it? Why, if that was the case, why do we not have signals in React? Because this idea is not new. In fact, it wasn't even a new idea when it came out in solid.js and it became all the rage in the new frameworks. Some iteration of signals has been around since Ember, and probably before that. So this is not an entirely new idea. And if the React team thought that signals would solve all of our problems, they may have adopted it by now, but they haven't. So why is that? Well, let's take a look at a few just quick comparison. I'm going to use solid.js here, not to pick on solid or say it's good or bad, but just as a comparator because they're the most prominent signals-based framework at the moment, and it's very similar to React. So you saw a lot of comparison code yesterday, but we'll just walk through a couple of examples. This is just a basic application written in React. You just create a component, render it inside of a root element, and then in solid.js, you essentially do the same thing. So the component code in this case, very much the same code. You can run it in either place, and it's totally fine. If we go in and we need some state in that component, right? In React, what do? We call useState. We pass, in this case, we might pass a function because we only want to initialize this state once. If the auth status is authorized, then we will return something that you can see if you're authorized. If not, we're going to return this, this sign-in form. And in Solid, you might do this. You think that the same thing would work, right? That's not Solid. There we go. That's Solid. You do the same thing, and that should work, right? Now, why not? Well, we have that little early return, and Solid tells us that we can't do that. Why can't we do that? Because, as Eric told us many times yesterday, our component only runs one time. Remember, the entire point, or the entire pitch for React at the very beginning was what happens if we just throw away everything and create it again based on the current state. It's that very simple mental model, but you can only do that if you render. You can only do that if you call the function again. If you only call the function once, you lose that benefit entirely. So we can't depend on that condition being reevaluated, so Solid creates some new APIs to deal with that. We import this show API, this show component, and we tell it the condition that it needs to match and a fallback in the event that that doesn't match. And so it is able to save that and listen to those signals, and when that signal changes, it will notify the show element and then show you the fallback. So it deals with it, but you have to think about it a little differently. It's not exactly the same mental model there. What happens if, say, the state of that component gets hoisted to a parent component, right? Okay, now they're just props. Okay, cool. We have a component. We've got some props at the top that we accept. We do the same conditional rendering in React. So then we refactor to Solid, and we have our show component. Everything should work, right? It does not. Why does it not work? Because props are signals, and signals are functions. They might not look like functions, and you don't call them directly, but they're implemented as getter functions. And so when you destructure them as arguments here, it doesn't work because you are detaching them from the object in which they are created, which is responsible for executing those signals when you retrieve the values. And thus, this is no longer a reactive component, so you have to do some refactoring now and make sure that you don't destructure those arguments, right? So, you know, a little bit of a trade-off here. Well, back in React land, let's say we need to implement a little side effect, and we want to sign the user out after a certain idle period. We do that in a use effect. Cool. All right. That's great. Oh, wait. We've got a couple things. We need to clear our timeout. Oh, wait. We forgot a couple things. We need to make sure that there's a dependency array. Otherwise, this thing's going to run on every render. Oh, wait. There's a dependency. The sign out function might change. Oh, wait. Did the parent component remember to memoize that sign out function? Because otherwise, this thing's going to run every time the parent component re-renders, and that might be a problem. So yeah, this is like also not really that ideal, right? This is how we end up kind of back in that place from the beginning where we started looking for other ways of doing things. So yeah, React is not perfect by any means, and I'm not up here to tell you that it is. But I do think it's still onto something. And to me, it all comes back to that very early promise that it made us, which is your UI is a function of your state. So I'm going to show just a really quick video. This is the React team gave a small panel, Q&A panel at RemixConf a few months ago, and I want you to hear their rationale. This is Joe from the React team talking about why they haven't implemented signals and what they're trying to do as alternatives. Oh yeah, conference Wi-Fi, baby. Also, we're not sharing the screen. These are those things that you prepare for. So I'm not going to show the video, I don't think. It seems like it's not going to work. So instead, I'm just going to try and summarize what Joe essentially said. What Joe said was that signals, while probably very useful, potentially as an implementation detail, essentially, signals as potentially an implementation detail in React, essentially that we write all of our React code exactly the same as we always have, and perhaps there's something internally in React that goes through and is able to find and figure out where exactly we've used certain state values, and more granularly update components based on those things. Signals and implementation detail, totally fine. But because of all of these trade-offs that we see in frameworks like Solid, like Eric made this point yesterday too, that we haven't used Solid enough yet to really know what the sharp edges are in that approach, right? It sounds nice because it's all new, but we thought the same thing when hooks were introduced. Like I thought that for sure. I thought for sure all of my code would be 90% cleaner, and then it turns out maybe some of it's not. So we don't really know the trade-offs fully until we start seeing some applications built at scale with Solid. But we do know that the React mental model works really, really well. We've got 10 years of experience behind us to tell us that this mental model works really, really well. And there's two problems essentially that signals are trying to solve for us. There's this problem of performance. Everyone thinks that rendering is bad for performance. 90% of the time, rendering is perfectly fine. In fact, that's what we want. We want to re-render because we want to make sure that our components is up to date with our state. But then again, 10% of the time, maybe the render is bad. Maybe it is causing a lot of performance issues and is expensive, and we have to go figure that out. Profiling is a giant pain in the ass, and we have to do it. But you know, it kind of sucks. So like, if signals can help us with that, why not implement signals? So there's the performance piece, and there's also the dependency arrays. We've talked a lot about this. It's easy. Not only is it easy to forget, and they've given us lint rules, but I mean, come on, who's not ignoring those lint rules all the time in their code, right? Like, I tell my team, like, I used to teach for React training, do workshops, and that's kind of the big thing that I ran into a lot, was just telling people not to ignore the lint rule, like it's there for a reason. 9 times out of 10, and I'd say like 9.999 times out of 10, you think you're smarter than the lint rule, you're probably not. So like, just don't ignore the lint rule, okay? There are better ways to profile for performance and prevent expensive renders and that sort of thing. But it is kind of a pain to have to constantly add things to the dependency array, and then suddenly you have a non-primitive value, and now I have to go up the tree and memoize that value, and we're prop drilling like 10 levels deep, so we have to memoize all those values. It's painful, so I get it. So if we can solve performance, and we can solve for the dependency array issue and for memoization, why don't we try and figure out how to solve those without sacrificing the React mental model? And that's exactly what they're working on. Anyone heard of React Forget? So they're working on this really cool, it's still experimental, and none of us unfortunately have been able to play with it yet, but you know, they move slowly over there in the React team, as they probably should, because they want to make sure they get things right. But it's a really cool idea, and it's essentially something that runs at compile time to auto-memoize values so that you don't have to use dependency arrays. You don't have to worry about memoizing functions and objects and whatnot. It can analyze that code for you and inject dependencies, just very similarly to how signals do it without signals, because signals are a runtime construct, and this is a compile time construct. So you get to sort of have your cake and eat it too. And so that's essentially what Joe was saying. If we can solve for these problems without sacrificing the core mental model, then I think we're going to be in a win-win situation here, and we don't need to hurry up and adopt signals, because yes, this might be a little painful in the 10% cases, but we're still really confident in that core mental model. And this is kind of where I land. And when you ask why I still choose React, it's, you know, Dan said once, so I don't even remember the question that he was asked here, something about like, why do you like React's composition model? And he said, essentially, I like how React deals with it, which is essentially you pass a piece of UI or a piece of code to UI, and it just works like any other value. It's not special. There's nothing unique about that value. It's not running some secret function behind the scenes and setting up event listeners. It's just a value, and no matter what happens in your application, state's updated here, it's updated there, no matter what happens, the state of that component always reflects that current value, and you don't have to think about time, right? And I think that's beautiful. I think still to this day, the core fundamental model in React is very strong. I think it's still the right choice. And if you want to use another framework, go ahead. But for me, I'm going to stick with the React. I've bet on them for a long time, and I'm going to continue to bet on them in the future. And that's my pitch. Thank you so much.